Well, it's a great honor, really, to be here to give this seminar for all sorts of reasons. It means a lot to me, so I really want to thank you again, Monica, and to thank Masaryk University in general for this invitation. And I'm really delighted to see you all. For those of you who already heard me this morning, I'm going to be talking about something slightly different, but not 100% different. So I apologize if there is a little bit of overlap with what I said this morning, and I hope you don't get too bored. I'll try my best. I want to talk more specifically about Britain's European policy today. So this is really much more topical maybe than what I talked about this morning, but it's still, at least it's really about the new Labour government and the extent of continuity and change between what the Starmer government is trying to do with Europe today compared with what his predecessors did after Brexit. So I'm really focusing on the post-Brexit period, even if I will say a word about maybe what happened before. I want to have a really short introduction first, and then I'll talk about Brexit and global Britain. This is something that I already covered this morning, so I'll be very quick on that, but I'll insist more on what this meant and the consequences of these choices for the position of Britain in the, well, not in, but vis-a-vis the European Union after Brexit. And then I'll really turn to the Labour Party. So that's something I hardly touched upon this morning. And what the party had in mind before coming to power first, and then what they've done in the last year and few months, 15, 16 months now, what they have called the reset with the European Union. So I'll look into this, what has been achieved, and maybe as important as the achievements are the limits to this reset. So I'm not really going into the long and complex and difficult history of Britain, first non-membership and then membership of the European Union. I suspect that you're all very familiar with this anyway. You probably know the image used by one of the scholars, a bit old now. Well, he's no longer with us, but the book is a bit old, but it remains very relevant. The awkward partner, as Stephen George put it at the time, with a late entry into the European community in 1973, a referendum in 1975, which gave a completely different result from the Brexit referendum, a referendum on whether to stay already in the European community, which gave a very wide majority in favor of staying. And yet, after that, a difficult member, especially under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, but not just under her, actually even before that, and certainly after her, whether it was on opposition to economic and monetary union, to the single currency, opposition to political union in the case of Margaret Thatcher, etc., etc. So a difficult, long history, which became then radicalized from the mid-90s and certainly in the decade that followed with the rise of Euroscepticism. The notion of Euroscepticism, as you know, appeared really in the mid-80s, even though you could argue that it applied to Britain even before it was actually used in the media first and in the academic literature afterwards. It was certainly particularly fitting in the British case, with a mix of hard Eurosceptics, including, of course, Nigel Farage, who really wanted to leave what had become the European Union, and soft Eurosceptics, especially, but not just, within the Conservative Party, but there had been also within the Labour Party. So people who disagreed with the way the European Union was developing, with some of its policies, without being actually in favor of leaving the European Union. So you have this really starting around the time of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 and developing in British public opinion, in the British press, at the time mostly the press, and then of course later in the social media as well, and within the Conservative Party. First as a sort of marginal or minority opinion, and then growing within the party and outside with the rise of UKIP, and led for most of the time by Nigel Farage. All of this, of course, is a long history, and I'm not going to go into any detail, but that explains why, under pressure from this increasingly strong current of Euroscepticism, David Cameron took the fateful decision to promise a referendum on whether to stay in, or leave the European Union, leading eventually to the referendum in June 2016. Since then, of course, what we've seen is, for a number of years, chaos, political chaos, with a number of Conservative prime ministers following the resignation of David Cameron, Theresa May first, then Boris Johnson for 3 years, then Liz Truss for a few weeks, and then Rishi Sunak. So 4 different Conservative prime ministers in only 8 years, all struggling with how to leave the European Union, being divided about both the terms under which Britain would actually leave the so-called withdrawal agreement, and even more important in the long term, being divided about what kind of relation they wanted to have with the European Union after Brexit. All of this is the background against which the Labour Party, in opposition for all this time, had to redefine its position. Having been a pro-Remain party and pro-European party in 2016, but confronted with this negative vote, which it felt bound to follow, to obey, it was a big challenge, really, for the Labour Party, and that's what I really want to talk about in this seminar. But before I do this, I just want to say a few words about the Conservative Party's ideas about what a post-Brexit foreign policy would be in general, and more specifically, what its relationship with Europe would be. So I don't want, once again, to repeat myself too much. So just a word about this idea of global Britain, which I already talked a little bit about this morning. It's the idea that membership of the EU had prevented Britain from nurturing, maintaining, sustaining its old links with a number of countries in the Commonwealth and outside, the so-called Anglosphere countries, so including the US, which of course is not in the Commonwealth, that this had been impeded by membership of the EU, and that once Britain finally got rid of the shackles, a word which was used a lot, of the EU, its bureaucratic weight, and its own its constraints in general on British sovereignty, London would be able to develop again and to renew with these countries and become a global power again. So a lot of it was, of course, about nostalgia for the empire, the good old days when Britain was a great power in the world. This started actually, this kind of discourse started way before the Brexit referendum. And I've put up for you here an extract from the general election manifesto of UKIP in 2015, so before the referendum, where, since I have this, I'm going to use it. So you see here the exact definition of what global Britain should be. The idea that you see here that Britain is not just European, but part of a global community, the Anglosphere. Okay, and that Britain would be able to open up from a small Eurocentric view of the world, wherein we're bound by EU membership not to negotiate our own trade deals, to becoming a sovereign nation that can trade with other countries, would once again inform our foreign policy, etc. So once we're unbound from the EU. So you see this kind of rhetoric opposing a European small, backward, declining Europe to the wonderful opportunities that exist in the world, and especially with this focus on trade. So you see this already here, and interestingly, what was at first simply a sort of UKIP mantra was adopted much more widely by conservative Brexiters. And you find it in Boris Johnson's, when Johnson was Prime Minister, particularly in the strategic review of 2021, which was called Global Britain. So if there was any doubt about where a post-Brexit British foreign policy was heading then, that was clear. And it was a very ambitious document, which of course you can have a look at, you can find on the internet if you're interested. And in his introduction, Johnson developed again this idea. So really taken from the sort of UKIP textbook and adapted to post-Brexit. Where did it go in practice? This is a map which is slightly old now. It's 2023, but I'm going to update it to you orally, which shows you the kind of wonderful free trade agreements that the UK was supposed to sign once it was out of the European Union. And you see, so in dark blue, like here, you have the trade agreements which were actually only free trade agreements that the EU had with these countries and which were simply rolled over by the British government. So the same free trade agreements which became bilateral, for example, South Africa, UK agreements, but which changed nothing since the UK had already had them as a member of the EU. So what is more interesting, of course, is the new deals in orange here. And you see that these were quite limited in 2023, with mostly at that point, Australia, New Zealand and Japan. Since then, and to be totally fair, a new important trade agreement was signed just a few months ago with India. And India, as an emerging economy, is a much bigger price in economic terms than having a free trade agreement with Australia. I mean, I have nothing against Australians, of course, but it's a very small economic market compared with India. The big prize that Brexiters were dreaming of has eluded them. The big prize was, of course, and those, they are in, where am I? Is the US. Because the US is a huge economic partner for the UK, not as big as the EU, but still very important. So having a free trade deal with the US would supposedly make a real difference in terms of GDP, except that neither Biden at first, nor obviously Trump today were keen to sign a free trade agreement with the UK. And it's very unlikely that Trump, who likes tariffs, who is going to agree to a free trade deal with the UK. So far, what would have been a really important, significant benefit of Brexit has eluded the UK. As for the UK's main trading partner, the EU, well, this is what we have. And you might be familiar with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that was eventually signed by Boris Johnson in December 2020, and which is about the new relation between the UK and the EU. This agreement is a very thin free trade agreement for goods only. Okay? So goods can travel freely between the EU and the UK, freely as in without tariffs, but not freely as in without any bureaucratic checks. These goods have to be checked. It's now done mostly online, so you don't have you remember the images of the queues of lorries in 21 when the agreement was first implemented. It led to massive queues in the ports of Calais on the French side and Dover in the UK for all these lorries full of food, among other things, being stopped because they needed to be checked by the customs. So a very limited free trade agreement, which does not cover in particular services. Services, as you know, in modern Western economies represent a big majority of the GDP. Services are not covered by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which means that compared with what Britain used to have with the single market, the loss is huge. Also, in this TCA, so here you have more details than I really want to talk about, but if you're interested, it's a document which is easy to find. What importantly as well is the fact that Boris Johnson refused to have, as I said this morning, a political declaration attached to the TCA, which would have provided a framework for cooperation between the UK and the EU on foreign and defense policy. Because he was still very much steeped into this global Britain rhetoric, and because he wanted to really make this point that Britain was no longer interested in Europe and that its foreign policy was now going to be global and not European, and because he was not a very serious prime minister, to be totally fair as well, and didn't want to work on that probably. So he was making a political signal that he was interested in global Britain, not incorporating with Europeans in foreign and defense policy. Plus, of course, there was the specific dimension of the Northern Ireland border, where Johnson had this, how can I put it, strange policy of first signing an agreement with the European Commission in the Withdrawal Agreement by which there would be a border in the Irish Sea so that there would be no control over goods traveling between the north and south of Ireland, and then reneging on his own signature. It's not even that he said what somebody else signed I don't like. It's what I signed myself, which in the end I decide not to implement. That caused a big crisis with the European Commission in 21-22. So this is really the background to what we're talking about. Finally, as part of this picture, global Britain, no to cooperation with the EU on foreign and defense policy, the last dimension is one that Monica knows well and has worked on, which is bilateralism. We don't want to have anything to do, or as little as possible to do, with the European Union, but it doesn't mean that we don't want to talk to the French or the Germans or the Czech or individual countries in the EU. And actually, and this is work done by our friend Cleo Davis and Hussein Kassim, Britain signed a whole list of bilateral agreements, including with the Czech Republic, in the years between basically 2021 and 23, so the early years of the actual Brexit, and these agreements covered a number of topics, but they weren't, in no way could they be a substitute for membership of the European Union. In particular, most of these agreements were non-binding. It was more like a declaration that we will work together or on such or such policy. And also, the UK failed to realize the extent to which individual EU member states would always prioritize their links with the EU, their membership of the EU, and their links with other member states on bilateral links with the UK. The case of Ireland was particularly interesting. Ireland is a very small country, which is not necessarily very influential. I shouldn't say this if there are Irish people among you, but it wasn't one of the most influential member states within the EU, let's put it this way. With Brexit, suddenly it became absolutely central. Why? Because, and especially in its dispute with the UK. Why? Because Ireland is a member state, whereas the UK was leaving the EU. So what the other member states did was to support one of them against somebody who was leaving anyway. And this is something that the UK had not really fully realized, a consequence of Brexit, well, one of the many consequences of Brexit, which the British hadn't really thought through before voting. So that's the background. I'm sorry if I was a bit too long. I have no idea of the time. I might be speaking too much. But let me move now to the Labour Party. But I really wanted to give you this background to show you how, in this context, Labour was going to redefine its position towards the EU. I'm not really going to talk about the period before Starmer became leader. If you're interested, let me advertise my own publication. If you're interested, and it covers the whole period. Here, I'm only going to talk about Starmer and first his shadow government and now his government. In foreign policy terms, general foreign policy terms, it was David Lammy, then shadow foreign secretary, who then became foreign secretary for a while, who developed what was supposed to be the Labour vision of a future government foreign policy, which was actually relatively vague. He talked about this idea of progressive realism. Realism as in the IR theory. Realism as in taking the world as it is, defending British interests, etc., but progressive, a reference to Labour, as opposed to conservative. So this is how he defined it. It's the sort of very general vision that, of course, no one can disagree with. What it tells you about actual foreign policy is, I think, quite limited. But anyway, that was the idea. What is interesting is that part of it, not in this extract, but in the article that he published in the New Statesman, part of it was about reconnecting with European countries and with the EU. So there was the idea that the Labour Party was distancing itself from the different conservative governments in line with its Remainer view at the time of the referendum. But the reality was actually a bit more ambiguous than that. And what I talk about more in the article is the extent to which Labour was actually extremely cautious. And we're seeing this with Monica about the Liberal Democrats as well. You could have thought that, especially in this context of total political chaos, it would have been quite easy for Labour to say, look at what they're doing, they've completely destroyed our relationship with the EU, it's completely stupid, we'll maybe not reverse Brexit, but at least we're going to be really active in again, maybe not reversing, but reversing some aspects of Brexit. And in particular, what could have been a central tenet of the Labour Party was to rejoin the single market. Because after all, the choice which Johnson made to leave not just the EU, but also the single market and the customs union was not obvious and had never been discussed during the referendum campaign. So you could have said, the Labour Party could have said, okay, you voted for Brexit, we have left the European Union, but the British voters never told us to leave the single market. So our suggestion is that we go back at least into the single market so that we don't have this economic damage that leaving the single market has led us into. That's not what happened. So I'll just read, if you don't mind, a couple of quotes by Starmer in 21 and 22 in different interviews or articles or speeches that he gave, where he talked about making Brexit work. Okay, not reversing Brexit, not changing the terms of the TCA, for example, but simply making Brexit work, whatever that meant. For example, he said, we have left the EU, there is no case for rejoining. We want to make our exit a success. How? That's interesting. We want the deal to work, the deal being the TCA. We're asking how we make the UK a great success under whatever trading arrangements we make with the EU and the wider world. Then again, Brexit has happened and we're not going to rejoin, but it is obvious that a poorly thought through Brexit is holding Britain back. So there was the idea that Brexit was fine, leaving the single market was fine. It's just that the TCA is not fine. So if we play a little bit with the edges of the TCA, if we improve some tiny bits of the TCA, we'll be fine and we'll make a success of Brexit. So that is really a very, limited way of, improving the terms of the withdrawal agreement and TCA. So that was in opposition. What have they done in power? That's what I want to talk about in my last few slides. So the so-called reset about the European Union, which I'm calling this from opt-outs to opt-ins, because there is a widespread view, at least in France, I don't know about here, that having benefited from opt-outs throughout its years of membership of the European Union, now that it's out, the UK is going to start to try to have opt-ins for a number of things with the European Union. At least that's the way French diplomats and officials see it at the moment. And they're, slightly saying, okay, now you want to come back and have some of the benefits that you didn't like. To be totally fair, the reset did not start with Starmer and his government in July 2024. It started really under Sunak, when Sunak found an agreement about Northern Ireland in the Windsor framework in early 2023, whereby you were still going to have the border in the Irish Sea, therefore checks on goods traveling from England and Scotland to Northern Ireland, but you would actually have two different lanes. I mean, you can imagine the bureaucratic complexity of it all. One so-called green lane for goods which would remain in Northern Ireland and therefore did not need to be checked because they would not get into the European Union, would remain within the UK, and a so-called red lane for goods which would be checked because they were then traveling to the EU, to Ireland. So this is a very complex system which is in place and which has placated the unionists of Northern Ireland, who were furious about the idea of having checks on goods traveling within Britain, from Britain to Northern Ireland. So that is pre-Labour. But what has really changed under Starmer is two things, really. One has to do with the TCA. It's the idea, what I was calling tinkering with the TCA to improve a little bit the trading between the two, between the EU and the UK. Especially on sanitary and phytosanitary checks at the border. So basically, it's the idea of trying to make it easier for food and plants and meat to travel between the two. In practice, that means it's only a plan so far, but it was the idea that, and it will probably come up to Britain following EU rules so that checks and controls are no longer necessary between the two. So that's one thing that Starmer wanted to do. He wanted also to make it easier for the EU to recognize professional qualifications for British workers and the other way around, to make it easier for them to have their degrees recognized in the rest, in the EU or in Britain. And he was interested, and that's the big difference with Johnson, of course. The other big area is defense and foreign policy. He was interested in setting up some sort of framework which would make regular cooperation and consultation between the UK and the EU possible. So that was his aim, and this was translated into a number of agreements reached at the first UK-EU summit post-Brexit, which took place in London in last May, where you had Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa, the president of the European Council, going to London to meet Starmer. And here they signed two possibly important documents. We'll see how that works out in the coming month. One is called the Common Understanding and covers all the economic aspects. Economic in the wide sense, but also mobility aspects. And the only actual agreement that was found was about fisheries. We talked already this morning about how important fisheries were for a number of countries, including my country. So France was very keen to have the original fishery agreements sustained for the next 15 years, 20 years, I don't even remember the details. That was the only actual agreement signed. Otherwise, it's a list of plans for the future which cover, in particular, something that might be important for you, which is the what used to be called the Youth Mobility Scheme, and which is now called the Youth Experience Scheme. Also something that Monica knows much more than I about, which is which is going to be very difficult. I think the agreement will be difficult to reach for a number of reasons, including fees, the question of fees, and also the fact that students are included in migration numbers in the UK, unlike in France, for instance. So if you're a British politician and you want to show that immigration figures are going down, you tend to want to limit the number of foreign students coming, even if British universities hope for more international students. So there's a contradiction there, and it might make the British government reluctant to agree to an ambitious youth mobility scheme. We'll see how that goes in the coming month. Cooperation on police and justice is also covered. That used to be an important part, especially access to databases on, criminals or whatever, which the UK used to have as a member of the EU and which it lost completely by leaving the EU. So that is potentially quite important. SPS is what I already talked about, sanitary and phytosanitary thing. And finally, energy. Energy is also a big issue at the moment, especially the idea of connecting grids, continental European grids with the British electric grid. That's something that the French are very keen on because they have this big nuclear energy sector that they are also developing in the UK. And so they are pushing for that as well. So what is interesting, this is really very much plans so far. And the precise discussions and negotiations are very difficult. This is what we hear from the press these days, is that it's not going smoothly. But it's the idea that all of this will be developed in the future. What is interesting from the British perspective is that it means that slowly, and I would say by stealth, the UK is, well, this government at least, is really ready to realign with a number of EU rules as long as it remains under the media radar. These are very technical issues, not something that Brexiters or Farage are really following closely. It's not in the media, so we can do it. Anything that is more spectacular than this is going to be much more difficult, I would argue. The second big area where Starmer is really taking the UK closer to the EU than before is, as I said, security and defense. And here you have a number of things that are in the second declaration that was published at the end of that summit, where, of course, in the context of Trump and Ukraine, the UK and the EU were very keen to remind everybody of how much they share in terms of not just interests, values, but also outlook on how the world should be ruled. Well, not really ruled, but how, and especially multilateralism. So a restatement of the importance of multilateralism, that's obviously a message to Trump. And they have put in place what should be a regular dialogue on foreign and defense policies. Every 6 months there will be meetings where the UK will join the EU. The possibility is open that the British Prime Minister might be invited to some meetings of the European Council to discuss, for example, sanctions against Russia or things like that. It hasn't happened yet, really, but we'll see how that goes. And there's an opening, which once again is only an opening at this point, and we don't know whether that will actually happen, but an opening for the UK to participate in the common defence and security policy operations, or at least crisis management, as well as in defense procurement with the SAFE program, which I mentioned already this morning. So these were really the achievements that have taken place in the last year or so, which would have been unthinkable under the previous governments. Whether this is really going very far is another matter. And this is what I really want to end with. It's the limits to this reset. First, in economic terms, I talked about tinkering at the edges. What would really have an impact on British growth, which is a big issue in the UK at the moment, would be to rejoin the single market, or at least the customs union. And that has been excluded from the start by the Starmer government. It's part of its so-called red lines for no obvious reasons. I mean, this is something that maybe we can discuss very soon once I'm done here. I still find it difficult to understand since there has never been any discussion about this, since the economic benefits would be obvious, and since the British economy is under so much pressure at the moment, and the Labour government, in a way, it has very little to lose now. It's so unpopular anyway. So why not being a bit more brave and confront this issue of the single market? I'm really not quite sure. There is also, turning to now not just the British side, but the EU side, what is also limiting the sort of impact that the UK has or could have is that the EU members are much less keen, and again, this is something we touched upon this morning, to see the UK playing a part in the EU. After all, the UK is now a third party. So if they want to follow the EU, fine. But why should we open the door, sort of back door to them, when they left just a few years ago? This is something that is present in some countries, certainly in my country. This is a sort of thing that you hear, not publicly, but in the corridors of power. This is something that you hear. There's also the feeling, and the Starmer government is still ambiguous about this, that Britain is trying to play it on both sides, wanting to get closer to the EU on the one hand, but also signing not a free trade, but a trade deal with Trump just a few months ago, and being proud that they managed to get slightly lower tariffs on their goods than the EU did. So there is a little bit of ambiguity here that EU member states sometimes resent a little bit. Which game are you playing? How can you want to be still a bridge between the EU and the US? Shouldn't you really be on our side 100% and not rejoice that you've had 15% tariffs instead of 20, or is it 20 instead of 25? Or, well, you see what I mean. If that is really that's going to make a big difference. Interestingly enough, and that takes us back to our interest for discourse analysis, the pro-Brexit discourse has remained very strong in the British debate in general, certainly until not long ago. And even Labour and indeed Liberal Democrat politicians felt compelled, as we saw, to talk about make Brexit work, rather than say Brexit was a terrible idea, which is difficult to say anyway to voters. I mean, I'm not saying that they should have done it. It is very difficult to do this. And only recently have we seen a few politicians like Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, blaming Brexit for some of the economic problems. But only very tentatively, once or twice, and trying to gauge the sort of reaction that this would create. And of course, you had Farage saying, "Oh, but it's not about Brexit. It's because you didn't manage Brexit well. But Brexit was great. It's because you are incompetent, or you, all the mainstream politicians." So it is still today difficult to argue in the UK that a lot of the economic problem, well, at least some of the economic problems could be mitigated by rejoining the single market. I think that plays a part as well, and limits the extent of this rapprochement, we would say in French. Finally, of course, the last limit and factor as well is what we talked about this morning, the rise of Reform UK in opinion polls, even if, once again, voters are more interested in showing their discontent towards the mainstream leaders than actually thinking about Europe or foreign policy more generally when voting for reform. That is still a big constraint on the party. There's still, on the party in power. Labour still feel that it's very difficult to be pro-European when you have Reform UK at 30 or 35% in the opinion polls. So I'll end here if that's okay with you, and thank you for your attention.